In the autumn of 1903, Dr. Edmund Ashworth found himself in possession of a peculiar inheritance. His uncle, the late Reverend Tobias Ashworth, had been the rector of St. Bartholomew's Church in the village of Ravensmere for nearly 40 years, and upon his death, sudden and unexplained, the local physician had noted with some disquiet the responsibility for sorting through his considerable estate fell to Edmund. His only surviving relation. Edmund was himself a man of scholarly disposition, a lecturer in medieval history at Cambridge, unmarried and approaching his 40th year with the resigned contentment of one who has found his truest companionship among books and manuscripts. He was a tall, thin figure, bespectacled and somewhat stooped from years bent over ancient texts, with prematurely graying hair and the pale complexion of one who spent too little time in natural light. His colleagues considered him amiable if somewhat distracted. His students found him knowledgeable if occasionally prone to wandering off into tangential historical minutiae. The journey to Ravensmere had taken the better part of a day, involving first the train from Cambridge to Norwich, then a local service to the market town of Walsham, and finally a trap hired from the Crown and Anchor Inn, which conveyed him along increasingly narrow and rutted roads through the flat, melancholy landscape of the Norfolk coast. It was early October, and the countryside wore the first signs of autumn's approach, the fields stubbled and brown, the trees beginning to turn, and over everything a peculiar quality of light, pale, diffuse, suggesting mist even where none was visible. Ravensmere itself proved to be a small village of perhaps 200 souls, clustered around a triangular green. The houses were mostly of the local flint, their walls glittering darkly in the weak afternoon sun, with here and there an older timber-framed building leaning at an uncomfortable angle. The church of St. Bartholomew stood at the eastern edge of the village, separated from the nearest houses by a considerable graveyard, overgrown and listing, its headstones worn smooth by centuries of salt wind from the sea, which lay some 3 miles distant, but made its presence felt in the air's sharp tang, and the cry of gulls overhead. The rectory stood adjacent to the church, a substantial Georgian building of red brick, somewhat severe in aspect, with tall windows that reflected the gray sky like blind eyes. Mrs. Gannett, the housekeeper who had served his uncle for 20 years, met him at the door. She was a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in unrelieved black, her face composed but her eyes, Edmund noticed, reddened as though from recent weeping. "Dr. Ashworth," she said, dropping a small curtsy, "we are glad you have come at last. The house has seemed very empty these past weeks." She led him through to the study, a room that occupied the entire eastern side of the house on the ground floor. It was an impressive space, lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, their contents representing the accumulated scholarship of his uncle's long tenure. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface barely visible beneath piles of papers, correspondence, and several volumes lying open, as though the reader had only just stepped away. "I have not disturbed anything, sir," Mrs. Gannett said, hovering at the threshold. "Mr. Ashworth, the Reverend, was most particular about his papers. He was working on something in those last weeks, working most urgently, I might say. Often I would find him here at dawn, having not been to bed at all." Edmund frowned, moving closer to the desk. "Was he unwell, Mrs. Gannett?" The letter from Mr. Wickham, the lawyer, mentioned a sudden apoplexy, but gave no details. The housekeeper's hands twisted in her apron. "Unwell in body, sir, I could not say. But in spirits, yes, something troubled him greatly. He had become interested in the church records, you see, the old ones from centuries past. He would spend hours in the vestry, going through the chests of documents stored there, and he would ask me questions, strange questions." "What sort of questions?" "About the old families of the parish, about properties that had stood here long ago and were now gone, and about," she hesitated, glancing toward the window, beyond which the churchyard stretched away toward the darkening horizon, "about things that were said to have happened here in the old times, things not spoken of, as a rule." Edmund felt a small stirring of interest, the scholar's instinct responding to the scent of historical mystery. "And did you answer his questions?" "As well as I could, sir. But I am not from Ravensmere originally. I came here as a bride 40 years ago." It was my husband, God rest him, who knew the old stories. He was born in the village, you see, as his fathers were before him going back who knows how long. But he has been gone these 15 years. She moved to light the lamps, for the afternoon was drawing in, and the study had grown quite dim. As the warm glow spread through the room, Edmund examined the papers on the desk more closely. They appeared to be transcriptions, in his uncle's neat, scholarly hand, of old parish records. Dates caught his eye: 1684, 1687, 1693, the period of the late Stuart monarchs, a time of religious upheaval and suspicion, of witch-finding and strange persecutions. One page in particular drew his attention. It was headed the Malpas family of Ravensmere Hall and contained what appeared to be notes toward a genealogy. The family name was vaguely familiar to Edmund from his reading in East Anglian history minor gentry, who had held lands in this region for several centuries. But his uncle's notes suggested a particular interest in the late 17th century, and besides several names were marks of interrogation, and in one case, a heavy underscoring accompanied by the single word disappeared. Mrs. Gannett, Edmund said, not looking up from the papers. What became of Ravensmere Hall? It burned, sir. A long time ago, more than 200 years, they say. Nothing remains but the foundations, out beyond the north field. The land was sold off piece by piece, and the family dispersed. The last of them died without heirs, or so I have heard, and the church records would contain documentation of all this. I suppose they must, sir. Baptisms, marriages, burials, all are recorded there, going back to when the registers were first required to be kept. Edmund nodded slowly, his mind already beginning to form a picture of his uncle's final work. Tobias had always been a meticulous historian, and it appeared he had stumbled upon some mystery or irregularity in the parish records that had captured his imagination. The question was, had it been merely academic interest, or had something more disturbing drawn him into those old, dusty documents? As Mrs. Gannett withdrew to prepare his supper, Edmund continued his examination of the desk. Beneath the transcribed records, he found a leather-bound notebook, its pages covered in his uncle's increasingly agitated handwriting. The entries were dated, beginning some 6 weeks before his death, and as Edmund read, he felt the first cold touch of unease. September 12th, have found reference in the vestry records to a curious matter. In 1693, 2 children of the Malpas family are noted as having vanished from the hall. No record of death, no explanation given. But in the accounts of the church wardens for that same year, there's an entry for the blessing of a new monument in the Malpas chapel, erected by Sir Edward Malpas himself. What monument? For whom? September 15th, examined the chapel today. There's indeed a memorial there to Sir Edward's wife, who died in 1690, but behind the altar, set into the wall, I found what appears to be a sealed doorway, plastered over and painted to match the surrounding stonework. It has been there so long that one would not notice it unless one knew to look. Why would a doorway be sealed in such a manner? September 19th, cannot rid myself of the conviction that something is hidden in that chapel. Have dreamed twice now of children's voices calling from behind the wall. Most disturbing. September 24th, have made discreet inquiries among the older parishioners. Mrs. Kettle, who is 90 if she is a day, became quite agitated when I mentioned the Malpas chapel. She said her grandmother had told her never to linger there after dark, that those that were wronged have not forgiven, and those that wronged them have not escaped. When I pressed her for details, she would say no more, only that some things are best left undisturbed. The entries continued in this vein for several more pages, documenting his uncle's growing obsession with the mystery. The handwriting deteriorated, becoming more hurried and irregular. The final entries were barely legible. October 4th, I have seen them. God help me, I have seen them in the churchyard at dusk. To small figures, standing among the graves, watching the rectory. When I approached, they vanished like smoke. But their faces, October 6th, they are in the house. Last night I heard them on the stairs. The sound of small feet, and a whispering that seemed to come from the very walls. I have taken to locking my door at night, but I do not think locks will keep them out. They are searching for something, or someone. October 8th, I understand now what Sir Edward did. I have found the evidence in the parish records, though it was well hidden. He was afraid of death, afraid of dying without air. The documents speak of a ritual, of hearts taken from the living to ensure life eternal. The children disappeared over the course of 2 years, his own nephew and niece, 12-year-old William and 10-year-old Elizabeth. Their parents had died in a fever, and they were in his care. He performed the ritual on St. Bartholomew's Eve, but he did not live to see the following spring. The fever took him, and in his delirium he confessed to the rector of that time. Though the confession was never made public, the children's bodies were placed behind the wall of the chapel, and it was sealed. But their hearts, what did he do with their hearts? October 10th. They know I have discovered their story. Last night they came to my very door. I heard their voices clearly. Let us in. Let us in. They sounded so pitiful, so lost. But there was something else beneath the words, something that filled me with a terror I cannot describe. I fear I have awakened something that should have remained sleeping. I fear the entry ended mid-sentence. There was nothing more written in the notebook. Edmund found that his hands were trembling slightly as he closed it. The rational part of his mind insisted that his uncle had clearly succumbed to some form of delusion in his final days, that the obsession with the old records had unhinged a mind already weakened by age and isolation. And yet, something in the careful documentation, the gradual progression from academic interest to visceral terror, struck him as horribly genuine. He rose from the desk and moved to the window. Night had fallen completely now, and beyond the glass, the churchyard was a confused mass of shadows, the headstones barely visible in the faint light that spilled from the rectory windows. As he watched, he thought he saw movement among the graves, something small and quick, there and gone in an instant. He told himself it was merely a cat or a fox hunting in the darkness, but he found himself stepping back from the window nonetheless. And when Mrs. Gannett called him to supper a few minutes later, he was grateful for the interruption. Edmund slept poorly that first night at the rectory. His bedroom was on the first floor, overlooking the churchyard, and though he had drawn the curtains firmly closed, he found himself acutely aware of the proximity of the church. Standing dark and silent beyond his window, the house itself seemed full of small sounds, the settling of old timbers, the whisper of wind in the eaves, the distant creak of a door or floorboard. And once, sometime after midnight, he woke suddenly with the conviction that someone had called his name. He lay rigid in the darkness, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Eventually, he rose and lit a candle, the warm light pushing back the shadows and making the room feel less oppressive. He found a book on the bedside table, a volume of Wordsworth's poems, and read until the sky began to lighten in the east, and he heard Mrs. Gannett moving about below, beginning her morning routine. At breakfast, he found himself studying the housekeeper more carefully. She was a solid, practical woman, not given to fancies, he judged, and yet he thought he detected a certain wariness in her manner, a tendency to glance toward the windows as though checking that all was well outside. Mrs. Gannett, he said, as she poured his coffee, how exactly did my uncle die? She set down the pot carefully before answering. It was a Sunday morning, sir. He had seemed well enough at breakfast, though quiet, but he had been quiet for several days. He went to the church early, as was his custom, to prepare for the morning service. When I arrived at 9:30 to see if he needed anything, I found him in the chapel, the Malpas chapel, sir, lying on the floor before the altar. She paused, her hands twisting in her apron again in that nervous gesture. His face, sir, I shall never forget his face. Such an expression of terror I have never seen on a living soul. He died of fright, then. The physician said it was an apoplexy, a sudden seizure of the heart. But I know what I saw, Dr. Ashworth. Whatever took him, it was terror that did it. Edmund felt a chill despite the warmth of the dining room. And the chapel, have you been in it since? No, sir, nor has anyone, so far as I know. The church warden, Mr. Pritchard, he has kept it locked, said it was out of respect for the reverend, but I think, she trailed off, then seemed to gather her courage. I think he is afraid, sir. I think we are all afraid. After breakfast, Edmund decided he must see the church and the chapel for himself. Whatever had troubled his uncle, whatever had driven him to such extremes of terror, it was clearly connected to that place. And as a scholar and a rational man, Edmund felt obliged to examine the evidence, to determine what truth, if any, lay behind his uncle's increasingly wild notions. The morning was gray and close, with a thick mist rolling in from the sea, obscuring the sun and turning the world into a realm of vague shapes and muffled sounds. The gravestones loomed out of the whiteness as Edmund made his way along the path to the church, their inscriptions worn to illegibility by time and weather. He noticed several that appeared very old indeed, their stones leaning at drunken angles, half sunk into the soft earth. The church itself was primarily perpendicular in style, dating from the 15th century, though Edmund's practiced eye detected traces of earlier work in Norman doorway in the north wall, the remnants of Saxon stonework in the tower foundations. He tried the main door and found it unlocked. It swung open with a groan of ancient hinges, and he stepped into the dim interior. The smell of old stone and candle wax enveloped him, mingled with a faint mustiness that spoke of inadequate ventilation and too many centuries of damp East Anglian weather. The nave stretched before him, the pews ranks of dark wood vanishing into the shadows, the floor a maze of memorial slabs commemorating the dead of 400 years. Light filtered weakly through the stained glass of the east window, casting pools of faded color across the chancel. Edmund walked slowly up the nave, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. There was something deeply unsettling about the silence, a quality of watchful waiting, as though the building itself were holding its breath. He told himself he was being fanciful, that the power of his uncle's written words had infected his imagination, but the feeling persisted nonetheless. The Malpas chapel lay to the south of the chancel, separated from the main body of the church by a handsome carved screen, its wooden figures dark with age. A modern lock had been affixed to the door in the screen, Mr. Pritchard's doing, no doubt, but Edmund had found the key among his uncle's effects and now fitted it into the lock. The door opened reluctantly, as though it too were unwilling to grant access to what lay beyond. Edmund stepped through into the chapel and immediately felt the temperature drop. It was markedly colder here than in the rest of the church, cold enough that he could see his breath misting in the air before him. The chapel was a small space, perhaps 15 feet square, with a stone altar at the eastern end beneath a narrow window. The walls were lined with monuments to the Malpas family, marble tablets recording births, deaths, and the virtues of the deceased in the florid language of past centuries. The most prominent was a large wall monument to the north, commemorating Sir Edward Malpas himself, who had died in 1694 at the age of 57. His effigy, carved in high relief, showed him in the costume of his period, bewigged and stern of countenance, his hands folded in prayer. But it was the east wall, behind the altar, that drew Edmund's attention. Just as his uncle's notes had indicated, there was something odd about the stonework there. A section of the wall, perhaps 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, was subtly different in texture and color from the surrounding masonry, as though it had been rebuilt at a later date and then carefully disguised. Edmund approached the altar and ran his hand over the wall. The stone felt unnaturally cold, and there was a faint texture of plaster beneath the paint. He pressed harder and thought he detected a slight give, as though there were a hollow space beyond Dr. Ashworth. He started violently and spun around. A man stood in the doorway of the chapel, silhouetted against the brighter light of the church beyond. He was short and broad, dressed in the rough clothes of a laborer, with a cap held respectfully in his hands. "I am sorry to startle you, sir," the man said, stepping forward. "I am Pritchard, the church warden. Mrs. Gannett mentioned you had arrived, and I thought I should pay my respects." Edmund's heart was still racing from the sudden intrusion, but he forced a smile. "Mr. Pritchard." "Yes, thank you. I was just examining my uncle's place of work, you might say." Pritchard's eyes flicked to the wall behind the altar, then quickly away. "A terrible business, his death, sir, terrible. He was a good man, the Reverend, much respected in the parish. Mrs. Gannett tells me you found him here, in this chapel." "Aye, sir. That I did. I had come to collect him for the service, as he had not appeared in the vestry at the usual time. And there he lay." Pritchard shook his head slowly. "I shall not easily forget it, sir." Edmund sensed an opportunity. "Mr. Pritchard, my uncle's papers suggest he had become very interested in the history of this chapel. particularly in the Malpas family. Do you know anything of that history?" The church warden was silent for a long moment, his blunt features troubled. When he spoke, his voice was low. "There are stories, sir, as there always are about the old families. The Malpases were gentry, but they were not well loved, particularly the last of them, this Sir Edward here." He nodded toward the monument. "My grandfather used to say there was bad blood in that line, that they had trafficked with things a Christian man should leave alone. When the hall burned, some years after Sir Edward's death, folks said it was God's judgment on the family, and the children William and Elizabeth Malpas. What became of them?" Pritchard's face paled visibly, and he took a step backward. "I do not know that story, sir, and if I did, I am not sure I would tell it. Some things are better left buried. But my uncle, your uncle, went digging where he should not have dug, begging your pardon, sir, and look what came of it." Pritchard's voice had risen slightly, and there was genuine fear in his eyes now. "This chapel has an ill reputation, Dr. Ashworth, always has done, as long as folk can remember. We do not come here after dark, and we do not speak over much of what may lie behind that wall. You know about the wall, then? You know something was sealed there." Pritchard backed toward the door. "I know that some doors should remain closed, sir. I know that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding, and that wisdom lies in leaving them alone. Your uncle did not have that wisdom, and it cost him dear." He clutched his cap more tightly. "I will bid you good day, sir, but I would counsel you most earnestly, I would counsel you to leave this place alone. Lock this chapel, take your uncle's papers, and return to Cambridge. Nothing good will come of pursuing this further." Before Edmund could respond, the church warden had turned and hurried away, his footsteps echoing through the empty church and then fading as he reached the outer door. Edmund was left alone in the chapel, the silence pressing in around him once more. He looked again at the wall, at the barely visible outline of what his uncle had believed to be a sealed doorway. Behind that wall, if the notes were to be believed, lay the mortal remains of two children, murdered more than 200 years ago by their own great-uncle in the pursuit of some dark and unholy purpose. As Edmund stood there, he became aware of a sound, so faint at first that he thought he might be imagining it. It was a soft, rhythmic noise, like the beating of a heart, or perhaps the sound of someone breathing very close by. He held his own breath, listening intently, and yes, there it was, unmistakable now, coming from behind the wall. The rational explanations presented themselves immediately. The wind in some hidden cavity in the stonework, the expansion and contraction of old materials, the sound of water dripping somewhere in the church's fabric. But standing there in that cold chapel, with the monuments of the dead all around him and the memory of his uncle's terrified face hanging in the air, Edmund found it difficult to maintain his scholarly detachment. The sound continued, steady and inexorable, and now Edmund thought he could detect something else beneath it, a whisper, or perhaps two whispers, the words too soft to distinguish, but the tone unmistakably plaintive, pleading. He backed away from the altar, his skin prickling, and as he did so, the light from the narrow window seemed to dim, as though a cloud had passed across the sun. The chapel grew darker still, the shadows in the corners deepening, and Edmund had the sudden, overwhelming conviction that he was not alone, that something was there with him in that small, cold space, something that had been waiting for a very long time and was now aware of his presence. He turned and walked quickly, not quite running, but close to it, out of the chapel and through the church. Only when he reached the porch and stepped out into the gray daylight did he allow himself to stop and draw a full breath. His hands, he noticed, were shaking. Back at the rectory, Edmund tried to lose himself in the routine work of sorting through his uncle's effects. There were letters to be answered, legal documents to be reviewed, household accounts to be settled, but his mind kept returning to the chapel, to that sealed wall and what might lie behind it, and to the soft, insistent sound that might have been nothing more than wind and water, but might have been something else entirely. As evening drew in, Mrs. Gannett served him a simple supper in the dining room. He asked her about the local legends surrounding the Malpas family, but she claimed to know little beyond what her husband had told her years ago, that they had been a proud and secretive family, that the last of them had died under circumstances that were not spoken of, and that it was considered unlucky to venture near the ruins of the hall after dark. Though why anyone would want to go there I cannot say, she added, setting a plate of cold mutton before him. It is nothing but tumbled stones and brambles now. A sad, desolate place. After she had retired for the night, Edmund sat up late, in the study, reading through more of his uncle's papers by lamplight. He found transcriptions of old court records, parish registers, and even fragments of what appeared to be a diary kept by a 17th century rector, the same man, perhaps, to whom Sir Edward Malpas had made his deathbed confession. The diary entries were difficult to read, both because of the archaic hand in which they were written, and because many sections had been damaged by damp or mice. But Edmund persevered, and gradually a dark picture began to emerge. Sir Edward Malpas, it seemed, had been a man consumed by the fear of death and the desire for immortality. Childless himself after the death of his wife, and with his own health failing, he had become obsessed with certain occult practices that had come to his attention through his reading. The diary spoke obliquely of the Hermetic texts and the wisdom of the ancients, of rituals that could, if properly performed, extend life indefinitely. The key, according to the beliefs Sir Edward had embraced, lay in the literal acquisition of another's life force through the taking of their heart. But not just any heart would suffice. It must be the heart of a child, innocent and unblemished, removed while the child still lived, and then preserved according to certain specific instructions. Two hearts were required from two children, taken during the same ceremonial period. Edmund felt sick as he read the careful notations his uncle had made. The children, William and Elizabeth, had been in Sir Edward's care after their parents died. They would have trusted him, would have had no reason to fear their great-uncle, and he had, if this account could be believed, betrayed that trust in the most monstrous fashion imaginable, taking their lives in the pursuit of his own extended existence. But the ritual had failed. Sir Edward had died less than a year after performing it, carried off by the same fever that had claimed several other villagers that winter, and the children, or what remained of them, had been placed behind the wall of the chapel, hidden away like a guilty secret, while Sir Edward himself was given a grand monument and a fulsome epitaph. Edmund set down the papers and rubbed his eyes. It was past midnight, and the house was utterly silent around him. He should go to bed, he knew, should try to sleep and approach the matter fresh in the morning. But he found himself oddly reluctant to leave the study, to venture out into the dark hallway and climb the stairs to his bedroom. Instead, he rose and went to the window. The mist had cleared, and the night was sharp and cold, with a waning moon low in the sky. The churchyard was visible in the pale light, the headstones casting long shadows across the grass, and there, among the graves, he saw them, two small figures, standing perfectly still between the rectory and the church. Even at this distance, even in the uncertain moonlight, Edmund could tell they were children, one taller than the other, both dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing. They were facing the house, facing the very window where he stood, asterisk. As he watched, frozen in place, one of them raised an arm and pointed directly at him. The gesture was somehow accusatory, demanding, and though he could not possibly have heard them at such a distance, through the closed window, he could have sworn he heard their voices in his mind, thin and distant as the cry of seabirds. "We are here. We are waiting. Why will you not let us in?" Edmund staggered back from the window, his heart hammering. When he looked again, the figures were gone, if they had ever truly been there at all. But the moonlit churchyard seemed to hold a watchful quality now, as though invisible eyes were trained on the rectory from among the graves. Patient and implacable, he left the study, locked the door behind him, and climbed the stairs to his room. But he did not sleep again that night, and when dawn finally came, gray and cold, he was already dressed and waiting for it. Edmund had resolved, in the watches of that sleepless night, to pursue his uncle's investigation to its conclusion. Whether this was scholarly curiosity, a sense of obligation to the dead man's memory, or something else, some compulsion he did not fully understand, he could not have said. But he knew that he could not simply close up the rectory, return to Cambridge, and pretend that none of this had happened. There was a mystery here. and possibly something more, an injustice that had lain hidden for more than 2 centuries, crying out, as his uncle had believed, for recognition and redress. After a hasty breakfast, he walked into the village proper, to the Crown and Anchor Inn, where he had arranged to meet with Mr. Wickham, his uncle's lawyer. Wickham was a small, precise man in his 60s, with steel-rimmed spectacles and the cautious manner of one who has spent a lifetime dealing with the complexities of rural property law. They discussed the estate, which was modest but sufficient, with the rectory itself being the property of the diocese and therefore not part of the inheritance, and Wickham outlined the various legal obligations that would need to be fulfilled. It was all quite straightforward, he assured Edmund, and should be concluded within a few months at most, though I confess, Wickham added, gathering up his papers, I am somewhat concerned about one matter. Your uncle had spoken to me, some weeks before his death, about the possibility of conducting certain investigations in the church. He wished to know what permissions might be required, what authorities would need to be consulted. What sort of investigations? Edmund asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. He was not entirely specific, but he mentioned the Malpas chapel and spoke of the necessity of examining behind certain walls. He seemed to believe that something of historical importance might be concealed there. Wickham peered at Edmund over his spectacles. I must tell you, Dr. Ashworth, that I counseled him most strongly against any such undertaking. The chapel is, of course, consecrated ground, and to disturb it without proper ecclesiastical authority would be highly irregular. Moreover, he hesitated. There are certain local sensibilities to consider. The villagers have very fixed ideas about that chapel. Any attempt to interfere with it would likely cause considerable distress. And yet my uncle seemed determined to proceed. He did, though I had the impression when last we spoke that his interests had shifted from the merely academic to something more urgent. He seemed troubled. Dr. Ashworth, deeply troubled. After Wickham departed, Edmund spent some time in the inn's small parlor, drinking coffee and considering his options. He could apply for the necessary permissions to examine the chapel properly, to open the sealed doorway and determine once and for all what lay behind it. But such a process would take months, perhaps longer, and would require him to remain in Ravensmere indefinitely. Moreover, he was not at all certain that permission would be granted, given the local opposition that Wickham had hinted at. Or he could simply let the matter drop, fulfill his legal obligations as executor of the estate, and return to his comfortable academic life in Cambridge. No one would blame him. No one would even know that he had briefly contemplated following his uncle down this dark and troubling path. But even as he considered this option, he knew he would not take it. Something had been awakened in him by his reading of his uncle's papers, by his glimpse of those 2 figures in the moonlit churchyard. He felt a strange sense of responsibility, a conviction that he had been brought to Ravensmere for a purpose, and that to turn away now would be a betrayal not just of his uncle's memory, but of something larger and more important. He was walking back through the village when he encountered an elderly woman, emerging from one of the flint cottages near the green. She was dressed entirely in black, leaning heavily on a stick, her face a mass of wrinkles from which 2 sharp blue eyes regarded him with evident interest. You'll be the Reverend's nephew, she said, without preamble. The scholar from Cambridge. I am Dr. Edmund Ashworth. Yes, he replied, removing his hat. And you are? Mrs. Kettle. I knew your uncle well as anyone did, I suppose, which is to say not well at all, for he kept himself to himself these last years. She looked him up and down with a frankness that was almost disconcerting. You have his look about you, the same long face, the same studious air. And you've been to the church, I'll warrant, and to that chapel. How did you? Mr. Pritchard told me. He's my sister's boy, you see, and he's all in a worry about it. Says you're asking questions about the old families, just as your uncle did. She gestured with her stick toward a bench on the green. Walk with me a ways, Dr. Ashworth. There are things you should know, if you're determined to meddle in this business. They sat together on the bench, looking out across the green toward the church tower rising above the rooftops. Mrs. Kettle was silent for a time, and Edmund did not press her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and reflective. My grandmother was born in this village in 1798, she said, and her grandmother before her was born here in 1728, and so back and back. Generations of us in the same few cottages, the same churchyard. When you come from such a line, you inherit not just property and name, but memory, the memory of things that happened long ago, but are not forgotten, that are passed down in whispers and warnings. The Malpases were lords here once, in the old times. They had the hall, which stood where now there's nothing but ruins, and they had lands stretching from the sea to the Walsham Road. Sir Edward was the last of them to have any real power, and he was feared. Dr. Ashworth, feared, not respected. There was something dark in him, my grandmother said, something that had been growing darker as he aged, and saw death approaching with no heir to carry on his name. She paused, her gnarled fingers tightening on her stick. When his nephew and niece came to live with him after their parents died, poor mites, they were only children. Folk said it was good that Sir Edward would have young ones. About the hall at last, that it might soften him. But it did not soften him. It gave him something else entirely, opportunity. The children disappeared on St. Bartholomew's Eve, 1693. That's the 24th of August, if you don't know your saints' days. There was a great search made for them. The whole village turned out, and the surrounding parishes too. They searched for days, but no trace was ever found. Sir Edward claimed they had run away, though where two children might run to in this empty country, and why they should want to leave a comfortable home, he could not say. He died the following spring, raving in fever. The rector of that time, a man named Havers, was called to attend him at the end, and heard his confession. What was said in that room, no one knows for certain, but Havers was never the same afterward. He left Ravensmere within the year, gave up his living, and went God knows where. But before he left, he told my great-great-grandmother, who was then a girl in service at the rectory, that there were evil things hidden in the chapel, and that they should never be disturbed. Edmund leaned forward intently. Mrs. Kettle, do you believe that Sir Edward murdered those children? The old woman turned to look at him directly, and her eyes were hard as flint. I believe he did worse than murder them, Dr. Ashworth. I believe he used them for purposes that would damn a man's soul, if souls there be, and I believe they have not rested quiet since. You've seen them then. The children. Once, I was 16 years old, walking home from a dance at the Hall Farm. This would have been in '63, more than 40 years ago now. It was a summer night, bright moonlight, and I passed through the churchyard as a shortcut, and there they were, standing by the chapel wall, holding hands and looking at me with such pitiful faces. I was not frightened at first. I thought they were real children, from some household I didn't know, lost perhaps. I called out to them, asked if they needed help, and then she shuddered at the memory. Then they began to fade, like mist in the morning sun, until there was nothing there at all. I ran home and didn't speak of it for years, but I knew what I had seen. Have others seen them? Oh, yes, not often, but often enough that everyone knows the tale. They appear at dusk, mostly, or on moonlit nights, sometimes in the churchyard, sometimes nearer to the rectory. They do not speak, as a rule, though some have claimed to hear weeping, and they point toward the chapel, as though showing where they lie. Edmund felt a chill run through him despite the weak sunshine. Mrs. Kettle, I found my uncle's notes. He believed that the children's bodies were placed behind a sealed wall in the Malpas chapel. Do you think that's true? I think it's more than likely. The chapel was Sir Edward's private domain. He paid for its construction, and he was the only one with a key during his lifetime. After his death, when the family died out, the chapel became the property of the parish. But no one has ever liked to linger there. There's a feeling about the place, a coldness that goes beyond mere temperature. Animals won't enter it. I've seen cats and dogs refuse to cross the threshold. And on certain nights, those who have passed by the church claim to hear sounds from within the chapel, scratching, as though someone were trying to claw their way out. She stood with some difficulty, leaning on her stick. Your uncle thought he could bring this matter to light, could give those poor children whatever peace remains to them. But opening that wall, if wall there be, would be dangerous, Dr. Ashworth. Not dangerous in any ordinary sense, but dangerous nonetheless. Whatever Sir Edward did, whatever binds those children to this place, it has had more than 2 centuries to strengthen and fester. I would not care to be the one who broke that seal. Edmund rose as well. Yet something must be done. If there is even a chance that those children were murdered and their bodies concealed, justice demands that the truth be brought to light. Mrs. Kettle shook her head slowly. Justice? After 200 years? What justice can there be now? Sir Edward is long dead and damned, if there is any justice in the universe at all. The children are gone, whatever remains of them. Let the dead bury the dead, Dr. Ashworth. Go back to Cambridge. Forget about Ravensmere and its sorrows. But even as she spoke, they both knew he would not heed her words. Some compulsion, some necessity he could not name, drew him forward on this path. He thanked her for her time and her candor, and made his way back toward the rectory. The afternoon had grown close and gray, with heavy clouds rolling in from the sea. The light had taken on that peculiar quality he had noticed before, at once bright and obscure, making the landscape seem flattened, two-dimensional. As he walked along the road that skirted the churchyard, Edmund found his eyes drawn repeatedly to the Malpas chapel, visible through the bare branches of the yew trees that grew among the graves. There was something about the chapel that seemed to draw the eye, even when one did not wish to look at it, a quality of wrongness, perhaps, or simply of significance, as though it were a focal point for forces invisible but nonetheless present. Edmund quickened his pace, eager to reach the relative safety of the rectory. He spent the remainder of the afternoon and evening in the study, making a careful inventory of his uncle's library. It was an impressive collection, representing the accumulation of a lifetime's scholarly pursuits, theology, and church history predominantly, but also volumes of local antiquarian interest, collections of folk tales and legends, and a small but choice selection of works on subjects that Edmund found surprising: alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, and even some rather disreputable texts on witchcraft and demonology. Had his uncle been researching these dark subjects in connection with the Malpas mystery, or had his interest predated his investigation of the chapel? Edmund could not tell, but he found the books disturbing nonetheless. Some of them were quite old, printed in the 16th or 17th centuries, their pages brittle and spotted with age. He handled them carefully, reading here and there, and found much that was obscure, much that seemed to be written in deliberate code or cipher, but also passages of horrible clarity describing rituals that should never have been committed to paper. One book in particular caught his attention, a slim volume bound in dark leather, with no title on the spine or cover. Inside, in a crabbed 17th century hand, was what appeared to be a grimoire manual of forbidden practices. The text was in Latin, but Edmund's scholarship was sufficient to translate the relevant passages, the section that his uncle had marked with a slip of paper inserted between the pages described a ritual called the translatio cordis, the translation of hearts. The principle was simple in its monstrousness. By consuming the hearts of two innocents, while they yet lived, a person could absorb their remaining years of life, adding them to his own. The ritual required specific timing: the 3 days surrounding the feast of Saint Bartholomew, patron saint of flaying and of those who work with the dead. Specific preparations: the hearts must be removed with a knife of silver under the rising moon, and specific consumption: the hearts must be eaten raw within an hour of their removal. While certain words of power are spoken, Edmund closed the book with shaking hands, feeling physically ill. If Sir Edward had truly followed these instructions, had truly performed such a ritual upon his own nephew and niece, the evil of it was almost beyond comprehension. And yet, his uncle's notes suggested that this was indeed what had happened, that this was the secret hidden behind the chapel wall for more than 2 centuries. Night had fallen while he read, and Mrs. Gannett had long since retired to her cottage at the edge of the rectory grounds. Edmund was alone in the house, and he felt that loneliness keenly. The study, which had seemed a comfortable refuge during the day, now felt exposed and vulnerable. The windows were dark mirrors reflecting the lamplight, and beyond them, the night pressed close. He was about to close the curtains when he saw, with a shock that stopped his heart, 2 pale faces looking in at him from the darkness outside. They were children's faces, as he had known they would be, one perhaps 12 years old, a boy with dark hair and solemn eyes, the other younger, a girl with a thin, delicate face framed by fair ringlets. They stared at him with an intensity that was almost palpable, their expressions neither threatening nor pleading, but simply observant, as though they were studying him, trying to determine his intentions. Edmund stood frozen, the grimoire still in his hands, meeting their gaze. He saw that their clothing was indeed of an antique cut, though strangely colorless, as though all the vibrancy had been leached out of it by time. They were translucent till he could see through them dimly, to the dark mass of the yew trees beyond, and yet they were undeniably present, undeniably real in some fashion that transcended ordinary reality. The boy's lips moved, forming words that Edmund could not hear through the glass, but somehow, in his mind, he heard them clearly. "We are trapped. We cannot rest. Help us." Edmund moved toward the window, driven by some impulse of compassion or curiosity. And as he did so, the children's expressions changed. The solemn observation gave way to something else, a terrible eagerness, a hunger that shocked him with its intensity. The girl raised her hands and pressed them against the glass, and where her palms touched, frost spread in delicate patterns, lacy and intricate. "Let us in," the boy said, the words clear now in Edmund's mind. "We are so cold. We have been cold for so long. Let us in, and we will show you where we lie. Let us in, and we will tell you everything." But something in their urgency frightened Edmund more than their appearance. He stepped back from the window, shaking his head, and as he did so, their faces transformed into masks of fury. The girl opened her mouth in a silent scream, and the boy's hands scrabbled at the glass. His fingers bent into claws. Edmund retreated further, nearly stumbling over a chair in his haste. He grabbed the curtains and pulled them closed with a violence that nearly tore them from their rings. For a moment, he stood there, breathing hard, half expecting the glass to shatter, for those small, terrible figures to force their way into the room. But there was only silence. After several minutes, Edmund gathered enough courage to peer through a gap in the curtains. The window showed only his own pale reflection, and the darkness beyond. The children, or whatever they truly were, had vanished. He spent the rest of that night huddled in an armchair before the study fire, dozing fitfully but never fully asleep, starting at every creak and groan of the old house. Only when dawn began to lighten the eastern sky did he finally relax enough to sleep properly. And when Mrs. Gannett found him there several hours later, she looked at his haggard face and asked no questions, merely brought him coffee and left him to himself. The following day was Sunday, and Edmund attended morning service at St. Bartholomew's. A young curate from Walsham conducted the service. In the absence of a permanent rector, his sermon earnest but unremarkable, his manner suggesting he was eager to discharge his duties and return to his own parish as quickly as possible. The congregation was small, perhaps 30 souls, mostly elderly, with a scattering of families with young children. Edmund sat near the back, ostensibly following the service, but in truth observing the church and its people with a scholar's attention. He noticed how the parishioners avoided looking toward the Malpas chapel, how they kept their distance from that side of the building when entering and leaving. He noticed, too, a certain wariness in how they regarded him, their glances sidelong and uncertain, as though they knew he had inherited not just his uncle's estate, but his dangerous curiosity as well. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the weak autumn sunshine, Edmund remained behind. He waited until he heard the last footsteps fading away, until the church was empty and silent once more, and then he made his way to the Malpas chapel. He had brought with him a small notebook and a pencil, and a measuring tape borrowed from Mrs. Gannett's sewing basket. If he could not yet gain permission to open the wall, he could at least make a thorough examination of it, could document what he saw and create a record that might prove useful later. The chapel was as cold as before, perhaps colder, despite the fact that it was a relatively mild morning. Edmund's breath plumed in the air as he approached the altar, and he noticed with some unease that the frost patterns left by the girl's hands on the study window had their echo here. Delicate traceries of ice covered the lower portions of the sealed wall, though the rest of the chapel showed no such phenomenon. He spent more than an hour measuring and sketching, tapping gently on the wall to determine its thickness, examining the edges where the newer stonework met the old. His investigation confirmed what his uncle had suspected. There was definitely a hollow space behind the wall, approximately 6 feet high, 4 feet wide, And as he determined by triangulating from measurements taken from outside the chapel, perhaps 3 feet deep, a small room, or more accurately a niche, set into the thickness of the wall, just large enough to hold, what, to small coffins perhaps, or to bodies without benefit of coffins. As he worked, Edmund became aware of a presence in the chapel, not the malevolent eagerness he had felt from the figures at the window, but something more subtle, a watching quality, a sense of being observed without being directly threatened. He looked up from his notebook more than once, his eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted nonetheless. He was kneeling before the altar, examining the lowest part of the sealed wall where the frost was thickest, when he noticed something he had missed before. Scratched into the plaster, so faint as to be almost invisible, were words. He leaned closer, his face inches from the cold surface, and made them out. Here they rest who have no rest. Here they lie who cannot sleep. Pray for us. The message was in English, not in an older language, and the letters were crudely formed, as though scratched with a nail or a piece of stone. Who had written it? When? Had it been there since the wall was sealed? A message left by someone who knew what lay behind it? Or had it appeared more recently, scratched into existence by what? By the restless spirits of the children themselves. Edmund copied the words carefully into his notebook, then sat back on his heels, troubled. The rational explanations for what he had experienced, the faces at the window, the sounds in the chapel, even these scratched words were becoming increasingly strained. He could no longer entirely dismiss his uncle's belief that something supernatural was at work here, that the murdered children had left some trace of themselves behind, some echo or imprint that persisted beyond death. And yet, to fully accept such a conclusion would require him to abandon the skeptical, materialist worldview that had sustained him throughout his academic career. Ghosts did not exist. The dead did not walk. Whatever people claimed to see, there was always a rational explanation. Misperception, imagination, natural phenomena misinterpreted. But what natural phenomenon could account for what he had seen? What trick of light could produce faces at a window, faces that moved and spoke and showed emotion? What psychological explanation could encompass Mrs. Kettle's testimony and Mr. Pritchard's fear, and his uncle's final, desperate notes? Lost in these reflections, Edmund was startled by a sound from the main body of the church, a door opening, footsteps approaching. He rose quickly, brushing dust from his trousers, and emerged from the chapel to find a woman standing in the nave. She was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in mourning, with a pale, intelligent face beneath a severe black bonnet. She regarded Edmund with a directness that reminded him of Mrs. Kettle, though her manner was less blunt, more refined. "Dr. Ashworth," she said, inclining her head slightly, "forgive me for intruding. I am Miss Sarah Darrow. I was your uncle's parishioner, and, I hope I may say, his friend." Edmund recalled the name from among his uncle's correspondence. "Miss Darrow, yes. You wrote to me after my uncle's death. A very kind letter. I wished to pay my respects in person, but I have been away visiting family in Suffolk. I returned only last night." She moved closer, and Edmund saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, as though she had been weeping recently. "Dr. Ashworth, I must speak with you about your uncle's death. There are things you should know, things I did not feel comfortable committing to paper." They sat together in one of the pews, the autumn light filtering through the stained glass above them and casting patterns of faded color across their laps. Miss Darrow clasped her hands tightly, as though to steady herself. "Before speaking, your uncle and I had become close in the months before his death," she began. "Not romantically, I hope you do not misunderstand me, but as fellow scholars. I have an interest in local history, you see, and have been compiling materials for a history of the parish. Your uncle encouraged this work and sometimes assisted me in my research. When he became interested in the Malpas family, he consulted with me, asked if I knew anything of their history. I was able to provide him with some documents, copies of old letters, fragments of household accounts that I had gathered from various sources. But I did not realize, at first, how deeply he was becoming involved in the matter, or how much it was beginning to affect him. In the last weeks of his life, he changed. Dr. Ashworth, he became haggard, fearful, convinced that he was being watched, being followed. He spoke of hearing voices in the night, of seeing figures in the churchyard that vanished when he approached. I thought, forgive me, that his mind was giving way, that the isolation of his life here had finally broken his reason. She paused, blinking rapidly, and Edmund saw tears on her cheeks. The last time I saw him was 3 days before his death. He came to my house in the village, and he was in a state of terrible agitation. He told me that he had uncovered the truth about the Malpas children, that he knew what Sir Edward had done, and he said, her voice broke slightly, he said that the children knew he had discovered their story, and that they were grateful, but that there was also anger in them, a terrible anger that had been building for 2 centuries. He said they wanted to be released, wanted their bodies to be properly buried, and their story to be told. But he also said that they frightened him, that there was something wrong about them, something that went beyond mere haunting. Edmund leaned forward intently. What did he mean by that? He said that when a death is violent and unjust, when it is accompanied by dark ritual and unholy purpose, the spirit that remains is not simply the echo of the person who died. It becomes contaminated, he said, twisted by the manner of death and the evil that surrounded it. He said the children he had seen were not truly William and Elizabeth Malpas anymore, but something that wore their forms, something that hungered and needed and wanted with an intensity that the living could scarcely comprehend. Edmund felt cold despite the fact that he was no longer in the chapel. Did he say what they wanted? To be free, to be acknowledged, and Miss Darrow hesitated, then continued in a whisper, to take back what was stolen from them. He was not entirely clear on that point, but I had the impression he meant their lives, their years. He said that Sir Edward's ritual had failed, that he had died before he could complete the process, but that the children's hearts had been taken nonetheless, and that without their hearts, they could not rest, could not move on to whatever lies beyond this world. Their hearts, Edmund repeated slowly. Of course, the ritual required that the hearts be consumed, but also that they be preserved. Where would Sir Edward have put them? Where would they be now? Miss Darrow shook her head. Your uncle believed they were still in the chapel, concealed somewhere near the bodies. He said he needed to open the wall, to search behind it, but that he was afraid of what he might find, and afraid of what might happen when the seal was broken. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Edmund asked, Miss Darrow, have you yourself experienced anything unusual? Have you seen the children? She looked at him steadily. Once, 2 nights ago, after I returned to Ravensmere, I could not sleep, and I went to my window to look out at the night, and there they were, standing in the lane outside my house, looking up at my window. I opened the casement, thinking I should call out to them, ask who they were and what they needed. But before I could speak, they turned and walked away hand in hand in the direction of the church. And as they walked, Dr. Ashworth, they faded, became less substantial, until they were no more than wisps of mist drifting through the darkness. I knew then that your uncle had not been mad, that what he claimed to have seen was real. Edmund nodded slowly. The cumulative weight of testimony was becoming impossible to dismiss. Too many people, of different ages and backgrounds, had seen the same phenomena. Whatever haunted Ravensmere, it was not merely the product of suggestion or imagination. Miss Darrow, he said finally, I intend to continue my uncle's investigation. I believe there is an injustice here that must be addressed, a wrong that must be set right. But I do not wish to proceed recklessly. Would you be willing to assist me? You know the parish better than I do, and you have access to documents that might prove valuable. She met his gaze directly. I am willing, but I must tell you, Dr. Ashworth, that I am afraid. Your uncle died pursuing this matter, and I do not wish to see you suffer the same fate. Whatever haunts this place, it is dangerous. We must proceed with great caution. They spent the remainder of that afternoon in Miss Darrow's cottage, a neat, well-ordered dwelling on the northern edge of the village, going through her collection of documents relating to the Malpas family. Much of it was routine property records, tax assessments, legal disputes, but there were also more personal items, letters, diary fragments, household accounts that hinted at the domestic life of the hall. One letter in particular caught Edmund's attention. It was dated August 10, 1693, and was written by Sir Edward's sister-in-law, the mother of William and Elizabeth, to a friend in Norwich. The writer was clearly unwell, her handwriting shaky, her sentences sometimes trailing off incomplete, but her meaning was clear enough. She was dying, she knew, and her greatest fear was what would become of her children after her death. She trusted her brother-in-law, she wrote, but there was something in his manner lately that disturbed her, a strange intensity, a way of looking at the children that made her uneasy. She had thought of making other arrangements for them, but had no close family remaining, and Sir Edward was, after all, their nearest relation. She was right to be afraid, Miss Darrow said quietly, reading over Edmund's shoulder. If only she had trusted her instincts, those children might have been saved. Edmund found another document of interest, an inventory of Sir Edward's personal effects, made after his death. Most of it was unremarkable clothing, books, furnishings of various kinds. But one entry gave him pause, one small chest of oak, banded with iron, locked, key not found, contents unknown. What became of this chest? Edmund asked. Miss Darrow consulted her notes. I don't know. There's no record of it in the sales made after Sir Edward's death, nor in the distribution of his property. It may have been lost in the fire that destroyed the hall, or it may still be in the chapel, Edmund suggested. Hidden with the bodies, perhaps. If the hearts were preserved, they would need to be kept in some kind of container. They looked at each other, the same realization dawning in both their minds. To truly lay this matter to rest, to give the children whatever peace was possible to them, they would need to open that wall, to search behind it, and to find if it still existed, that locked chest and its dreadful contents. As evening drew in and Miss Darrow lit the lamps in her parlor, they discussed how to proceed. To obtain official permission would take months and might well be refused, but to act without permission would be irregular at best, illegal at worst, and could result in serious consequences for both of them. However, Edmund said slowly, as my uncle's executor, I have a certain authority over his effects and his affairs, and as the former rector, he had responsibility for the church and its maintenance. If I were to discover, in the course of examining the church fabric, that urgent repairs were needed in the Malpas chapel repairs, that might require the removal of certain elements of the structure, well, that would be a matter for the diocese to consider. But in the interim, Miss Darrow understood immediately. You propose to open the wall yourself under the pretext of examining the structure? Not a pretext, Edmund corrected. I genuinely wish to examine the structure, and if, in the course of that examination, I should discover something of historical or legal significance, then I would of course report it to the proper authorities immediately. It was sophistry, and they both knew it, but the alternative to simply wait while the proper channels were consulted, while committees deliberated and permissions were sought or denied, was unthinkable. Edmund had inherited his uncle's sense of urgency, his conviction that delay was no longer possible. They agreed to act the following night, when the village would be asleep and their activities would be less likely to draw attention. Miss Darrow would procure the necessary tools, a hammer and chisel, a crowbar, and a lantern, while Edmund would ensure that Mrs. Gannett was safely away from the rectory, perhaps sent on some errand that would occupy her for the evening. As Edmund walked back to the rectory through the gathering dusk, he felt a curious mixture of anticipation and dread. He was committed now to a course of action that would likely alter his life irreversibly, that might destroy his reputation and career if it went wrong. And yet he felt no desire to turn back, no wish to reconsider. Some force, whether conscience, curiosity, or something else, drove him forward inexorably. The churchyard was dark as he passed through it, the headstones mere shadows in the gloom. And yet he was aware, with a certainty that bypassed rational thought, that he was being watched. From among the graves, from the deeper darkness beneath the yew trees, eyes followed his progress. Not hostile, exactly, but profoundly intent, waiting to see what he would do. He did not look directly toward where he sensed the watchers, did not give any sign that he knew they were there. But as he reached the rectory gate, he heard, faint but unmistakable, the sound of children's laughter, high, thin, and filled with a terrible anticipation. Edmund slept poorly again that night, troubled by dreams in which he was searching through a dark, endless building, opening door after door, looking for something he could not name but knew he must find. In the dreams, he could hear children's voices calling to him from far away, but no matter how quickly he moved, he could not reach them. And always, in the deepest shadows, he sensed another presence, something old and malevolent, something that watched his efforts with cold amusement. He woke several times, each time with his heart racing, and lay listening to the silence of the house. Once, he thought he heard footsteps on the stairs, soft and slow, like those of a child climbing carefully in the dark. But when he rose and looked out into the hallway, he saw nothing. The moonlight streaming through the landing window showed only empty boards, and the closed doors of unused bedrooms. Morning brought a gray, misty day, with low clouds obscuring the sky and a damp chill that penetrated everything. After breakfast, Edmund returned to the study and spent several hours organizing his uncle's papers, making notes on what he had learned, preparing what amounted to a brief for the investigation he and Miss Darrow would conduct that evening. He found more letters from his uncle to various antiquarian colleagues, asking about rituals of the 17th century, about beliefs concerning the soul and its relationship to the physical body, about cases where bodies had been concealed in churches and other consecrated buildings. The responses, when there were any, were generally skeptical or dismissive. One correspondent suggested gently that his uncle might benefit from a holiday, a change of scene, a rest from his scholarly labors. But there was one letter, from a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London, that took his uncle's inquiries seriously. The correspondent, a Mr. Gabriel Hartwell, wrote that he had indeed come across accounts of similar instances, where murders had been committed as part of occult rituals, where the bodies had been hidden in secret locations, and where subsequent manifestations had suggested that the dead had not found peace. In every such case I have studied, Hartwell wrote, the resolution has required two things. First, the discovery and proper burial of the remains. Second, the recovery and destruction of whatever physical objects were used in the original ritual. Without both these actions, the haunting tends to persist, often growing more violent with time. The spirits involved seem to exist in a state of terrible incompleteness, aware of what was done to them but unable to move beyond it. They are caught, as it were, between worlds, neither fully dead nor able to return to life. This confirmed Edmund's own thinking. Simply opening the wall and finding the bodies would not be enough. They would need to find the children's hearts or whatever remained of them, and ensure their destruction or proper disposal. In the afternoon, Edmund walked out to visit the ruins of Ravensmere Hall. Miss Darrow had given him directions, a mile beyond the village to the north, along a track that was little more than a footpath now, overgrown and muddy. The day remained gray and close, with the mist thickening as he walked, until he could see no more than 20 yards in any direction. The ruins, when he reached them, were more extensive than he had expected. The hall had been a substantial building, and its foundations still traced the outline of rooms and corridors, though the walls rose no more than a few feet above ground level and were choked with brambles and elder. The local flint had been scavenged over the years for use in other buildings, but enough remained to show that this had once been an impressive structure. Edmund walked slowly through the ruins, trying to reconstruct in his mind what the hall must have looked like in Sir Edward's time. Here would have been the great hall, there the kitchens and service quarters, and at the eastern end, rising slightly above the rest, what must have been the private apartments where the family lived. It was a melancholy place, made more so by the mist and the silence and the sense of lives long vanished, leaving behind only these tumbled stones. He was standing in what appeared to have been the great hall when he noticed something odd. In the center of the space, where the hearth would have been, the ground was discolored darker than the surrounding earth, as though something had stained it deeply. He knelt and ran his fingers over the soil, and they came away with a faint reddish tinge. Blood? After 200 years? It seemed impossible, and yet there were accounts in the literature of blood-soaked ground remaining discolored for centuries, particularly where violence had been extreme. If the ritual had been performed here, if the children's hearts had been taken in this very spot. Edmund rose quickly, suddenly eager to be away from this place. There was a wrongness about it that went beyond mere ruin and decay, a sense of old evil still lingering like a miasma in the mist-laden air. As he hurried back toward the track, he thought he heard, very faint, the sound of children weeping. He did not look back. That evening, after Mrs. Gannett had retired, Edmund changed into his oldest clothes and gathered the few tools. He possessed a small hammer, a penknife, a dark lantern borrowed from the rectory's stores. Miss Darrow was to meet him at the church at 10 o'clock, bringing the larger tools they would need. The night was moonless, and the mist that had shrouded the day persisted, making the churchyard a realm of vague shapes and muffled sounds. Edmund's lantern cast a small pool of light around him as he made his way along the path. But beyond that circle, the darkness was absolute. Miss Darrow was waiting at the church porch, a cloaked figure barely visible in the gloom. She carried a leather bag that clinked softly as she moved. "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Edmund asked in a low voice, though there was no one to overhear them. "I am certain," she replied firmly, "for your uncle's sake, and for those poor children. This has gone on long enough." They entered the church together, and Edmund locked the door behind them. The interior was utterly black, and their lanterns did little to dispel the darkness, merely creating small islands of light that made the shadows seem deeper by contrast. The pews were vague masses, the distant altar barely visible, and overhead, the ceiling was lost in absolute blackness. They made their way to the Malpas chapel, their footsteps echoing in the vast silence. Edmund unlocked the screen door, and they stepped into the smaller space. Immediately, the temperature dropped so precipitously that they could see their breath forming thick clouds. "In the lantern light, it is even colder than before," Edmund murmured, setting his lantern on the floor near the altar. Miss Darrow placed hers beside it and unpacked the tools she had brought: a heavy hammer, a cold chisel, a crowbar, and several sacks for disposing of the debris. They stood for a moment before the sealed wall, and Edmund felt a strange reluctance to begin. Once they broke through that barrier, once they opened what had been sealed for more than 2 centuries, there would be no going back. They would be committed to whatever consequences followed. "Shall we begin?" Miss Darrow asked, her voice steady despite the fear Edmund could see in her eyes. He nodded and took up the chisel and hammer. "The plaster first, I think, to see what lies beneath." The first blow of the hammer against the chisel rang out shockingly loud in the confined space. Edmund winced, certain the sound would carry across the village, would bring the church warden and half the population running to see what was happening. But there was no response, no alarm raised, and after a moment he struck again. The plaster was old and brittle, and it came away in large chunks, falling to the floor with soft thuds. Beneath it, as Edmund had suspected, was stonework, but not the solid wall one would expect. Instead, there was a rough framework of stones, clearly mortared in place, but with gaps between them, as though the wall had been built hastily, without care for proper technique. This was never meant to be a permanent structure, Miss Darrow observed, leaning closer to examine it. It was meant simply to seal off the space behind it. Edmund continued working, removing more plaster, widening the hole until a section perhaps 3 feet square was exposed. The stones beneath could be removed, he saw, if one worked carefully. They were not load-bearing. The weight of the wall above was supported by the original structure on either side. He set down the hammer and chisel and took up the crowbar. Wedging it between 2 of the stones, he pried gently and felt one of them give. Another few minutes of careful work, and the first stone came free, leaving a dark opening into the space beyond. Edmund held his lantern up to the gap and peered through. At first, he could see nothing, just blackness, and perhaps a gleam of something pale deeper in the recess. But as his eyes adjusted, he began to make out shapes. There were bones, small bones, the bones of children, lying into heaps near the back of the niche. They had not been placed in coffins, had not been given even that minimal respect. They had simply been thrust into the cavity and walled up, left to decay in the darkness. Edmund felt sick. The abstract horror of reading about what Sir Edward had done was nothing compared to the reality of seeing the evidence of his crime, seeing the pathetic remains of his victims lying in their secret tomb. "What do you see?" Miss Darrow asked quietly. "The children, or what remains of them." Edmund stepped back from the opening, his face pale. "We need to remove more stones. We need to be able to reach them, too. To do what must be done." They worked together for the next half hour, carefully removing stone after stone, widening the opening until it was large enough for Edmund to squeeze through. All the while, the chapel grew colder still, until the chill seemed to penetrate to their very bones. And there were sounds now, too soft sounds, like whispered voices or the rustle of clothing, coming from no identifiable source, but seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. Finally, the opening was large enough. Edmund took his lantern and, steeling himself, climbed through into the sealed niche. It was a cramped, horrible space, barely large enough for him to crouch. The bones lay before him, pitifully small, still partially clothed in scraps of fabric that had somehow survived the centuries. Edmund could make out the remains of what had been a boy's jacket, and near it, the faded ribbons from a girl's dress. But what drew his attention, what made his breath catch in his throat, was the small chest that sat between the two sets of remains. It was perhaps a foot long and half a foot wide, made of dark oak and banded with iron, exactly as described in Sir Edward's inventory, and it was locked, a heavy, ancient padlock securing the lid. Edmund woke to find Mrs. Gannett standing in the study doorway, her face a mask of concern and disapproval. "Dr. Ashworth, you have been here all night? This is most unhealthy, sir. You will make yourself ill." He sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his neck and back. Morning light streamed through the windows, bright and clean, making the events of the previous night seem unreal, dreamlike. But the chest still sat on the desk, a tangible reminder that it had all been terribly, undeniably real. "Mrs. Gannett," he said, rising and stretching, "I must ask you to go into Walsham today. There are some things I need from the chemist, and some telegrams I need sent." He wrote out a list quickly, including a message to be sent to the Bishop of Norwich requesting an urgent meeting, and another to Mr. Wickham the lawyer. "Please take the trap, and don't hurry back. In fact, you might visit your sister. Doesn't she live in Walsham? Stay the night if you wish." Mrs. Gannett looked at him suspiciously. "What are you about, Dr. Ashworth? What is that chest on the desk?" "Nothing that need concern you," Edmund said firmly. "Please, just do as I ask. It's important." Reluctantly, the housekeeper departed, and Edmund was left alone in the rectory. He washed and changed clothes, ate a hasty breakfast, and then sat down to write a detailed account of all that had happened. He documented everything: his uncle's notes, his own investigations, the testimonies he had gathered, and the events of the previous night. It was important that there be a record, he felt, something that could be presented to the authorities as evidence that what they had done was necessary and justified. He was still writing when Miss Darrow arrived mid-morning, accompanied by another woman whom she introduced as her sister, Mrs. Helena Marsh. "Helena insisted on coming when I told her what we had discovered," Miss Darrow explained. "She is more level-headed than I, and I thought we might benefit from her counsel." Mrs. Marsh was indeed a practical-seeming person, perhaps 35 years old, with the air of one accustomed to managing difficult situations. She was a widow, Miss Darrow explained, and had been living with her sister for the past year. "Miss Darrow has told me the whole story," Mrs. Marsh said, settling into a chair and regarding Edmund with calm, assessing eyes. "I confess I am skeptical of supernatural explanations, Dr. Ashworth, but I am also not fool enough to dismiss what my sister claims to have experienced. May I see this chest?" Edmund indicated the box on the desk, and Mrs. Marsh rose and examined it carefully, though she did not attempt to open it. "And you believe these are the preserved hearts of the murdered children?" "I do, and I believe that until they are destroyed, and the children's remains properly buried, there will be no peace at Ravensmere." Mrs. Marsh nodded slowly. "Then we must proceed methodically. First, the authorities must be notified, both ecclesiastical and civil. Second, the remains in the chapel must be examined by someone qualified to do so, a physician, perhaps, or a coroner. Third, arrangements must be made for a proper burial. And finally," she looked at the chest again, "finally, these items must be disposed of in a manner that is both respectful and final. I have sent telegrams to the bishop and to the local magistrate," Edmund said, "but I fear we may not receive responses for several days. And in the meantime, we must keep the chest secure," Mrs. Marsh finished. "Dr. Ashworth, have you experienced any further manifestations since last night?" Edmund shook his head. "Nothing. The house has been quiet, and when I looked out at the churchyard this morning, I saw nothing unusual. That may be a good sign, Miss Darrow suggested. Perhaps the children are satisfied that we are acting on their behalf. But even as she spoke, Edmund felt a chill run through him, and he saw Mrs. Marsh shiver as well. The temperature in the study had dropped noticeably, and there was a quality to the air now, a thickness, a sense of presence, or perhaps, Mrs. Marsh said quietly, "They are here now." Watching to see what we will do, Edmund rose and went to the window. The day had been bright, but now clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, piling up in dark masses that obscured the sun. The churchyard, which had been clearly visible minutes before, was now shrouded in shadow, and as Edmund watched, he saw movement among the grave's small figures, appearing and disappearing between the headstones, as though playing some ghostly game of hide-and-seek. "They're restless," he murmured. "Last night, they seemed almost grateful, but now there's an agitation about them." Miss Darrow joined him at the window, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. "There," she said, pointing, "by the gate. Do you see?" Edmund looked where she indicated and saw, standing at the entrance to the churchyard, two figures more solid and distinct than any he had yet seen. They were children, unmistakably the boy perhaps 12, the girl younger, both dressed in the costume of the late 17th century. They stood hand in hand, facing the rectory, and even at this distance, Edmund could see their eyes fixed on the window where he stood. As he watched, the boy raised his free hand and beckoned a clear gesture of invitation or command, and then both children turned and walked toward the church, not fading as they usually did, but remaining solid and visible until they passed through the church door, literally through it, as though it were not there. "They want us to come," Miss Darrow said. "No," Mrs. Marsh said firmly, joining them at the window. "Absolutely not. Dr. Ashworth, Miss Darrow, I must insist that we wait for the proper authorities, whatever those entities want." It would be foolish to. She was interrupted by a sound that made all three of them start. A knock at the study door. Loud and sharp, 3 times in quick succession, Edmund crossed the room and opened the door. The hallway beyond was empty, but as he stood there, he heard footsteps above him, small, light footsteps running along the upper hallway. Then a door slammed, and there was silence. "Mrs. Gannett," Edmund called, though he knew the housekeeper had left hours ago. There was no answer. Miss Darrow had gone pale. "They're in the house. Dr. Ashworth, I think we should leave. We should take the chest and go into the village, wait there for the bishop's response." But Edmund shook his head. "No, we can't run from this. They're not trying to harm us. If they wanted to do that, they've had ample opportunity. They're trying to tell us something, to show us something." He moved back to the desk and picked up the chest. It was cold in his hands, as it had been before, but he thought he detected something else now, a vibration, almost as though something inside were moving, pulsing with a life of its own. "We're going to the church," he said. "We're going to take this with us, and we're going to see what they want us to understand." Mrs. Marsh protested, but Edmund was already moving toward the door, and after a moment's hesitation, both women followed. They left the rectory and crossed the short distance to the churchyard gate, Edmund leading the way with the chest clutched to his breast. The 2 women closed behind. The clouds had darkened further, and the light had taken on a strange, greenish quality, as though a storm were approaching. But there was no wind, no sound of thunder, only an oppressive silence broken by the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path. As they approached the church, the door swung open before them, though no hand had touched it. Edmund paused on the threshold, suddenly afraid in a way he had not been before. Everything that had happened until now had been preparation, investigation, discovery. But crossing this threshold, entering the church with the chest in his hands, felt like stepping across some invisible boundary into a realm where the rules of the normal world no longer applied. "Dr. Ashworth," Miss Darrow said softly, touching his arm. "We don't have to do this. Not alone, not now." But Edmund thought of his uncle dying in terror on the chapel floor. He thought of Mrs. Kettle's testimony and Mr. Pritchard's fear, and all the years of whispers and evasions that had surrounded this place. Most of all, he thought of 2 children murdered for the mad ambitions of their great-uncle, denied burial and peace for more than 2 centuries. "Yes," he said quietly, "we do." He stepped into the church, and the women followed. The interior was dim despite the hour, the light filtering through the stained glass windows casting pools of colored shadow. Across the floor, the air was thick and cold, and Edmund could see his breath misting before him. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps as they moved up the nave toward the Malpas. Chapel. The screen door stood open, though Edmund distinctly remembered locking it the night before. Beyond it, the chapel waited, and in the chapel, Edmund could see them clearly now, William and Elizabeth Malpas, standing before the altar, their forms more solid than he had yet seen them, almost indistinguishable from living children. Almost, but not quite. There was a translucency to them still, a quality of otherworldliness that marked them as something other than human. And their eyes were old, far older than their apparent years, filled with a knowledge and a sorrow that no child should ever possess. Edmund entered the chapel, and the temperature plummeted. His breath now came in great clouds of mist, and ice was forming on the stone walls, spreading in delicate crystalline patterns that caught and refracted the dim light. "You came," Elizabeth said, her voice clear but somehow distant, as though it were being carried from a great distance. "You brought them." "Our hearts." "Yes," Edmund said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to control it. "What would you have us do?" William pointed toward the sealed wall, or rather, toward the opening they had made the night before. "Put them back. Put them with us. We must be whole again before we can rest." Edmund moved forward and climbed through the opening into the niche where the children's bones lay. He set the chest down carefully between the two sets of remains, opened it, and looked at the shriveled hearts inside. "Should I?" He wasn't sure how to phrase the question. "Place them with us," Elizabeth said. She was standing just outside the opening now, looking in at her own bones with an expression Edmund could not read. "William's with William, mine with me. Make us whole again." With trembling hands, Edmund lifted the first heart from the chest. It was surprisingly solid, heavy with the salt and preservatives that had kept it from complete decay. He placed it carefully among the smaller pile of bones, the ones adorned with scraps of a girl's dress, and as he did so, he felt a shock run through him, a pulse of emotion so intense it nearly knocked him backward. Grief, longing, and something else, something that might have been joy. He lifted the second heart and placed it with the other set of remains, and again felt that pulse of emotion. Though different this time, anger was mixed with the grief, a fierce, burning rage that had been nursed for centuries and showed no sign of fading. "Now," William said, his voice taking on an edge of command that was startling in its authority. "Now you must seal the wall again. We must rest in darkness as we have rested before, but this time we will be complete. This time, when the fire comes, we will be ready." "Fire?" Edmund asked, climbing back out of the niche. "What fire?" "The fire that should have come long ago," Elizabeth said. Her form was beginning to flicker now, fading in and out of visibility. "The fire that will cleanse this place. But first, the wall must be sealed, or he will prevent what must happen." "Sir Edward?" Edmund asked. Both children nodded in unison. "He is here," William said. "He is always here. He knows what we intend, and he will try to stop it. He cannot bear to see his sin destroyed, cannot bear to lose the last physical evidence of what he did. While the hearts remain, while our bones lie here, he remains bound to this place, trapped by his own evil. But he will fight to keep it so, because the alternative, the final dissolution, the accounting that awaits him, is worse than any torment he suffers now." Edmund looked at Miss Darrow and Mrs. Marsh, who had remained by the chapel door, watching with wide eyes. "Help me," he said. "We need to put the stones back, seal the opening again." They worked quickly, urgently, replacing the stones they had removed the night before, mortaring them into place with a mixture Edmund prepared from materials in the church vestry. As they worked, the air grew colder still, and strange sounds began to echo through the church, footsteps that were not theirs, doors slamming in distant rooms, and once, a voice raised in anger, shouting words in a language Edmund did not recognize. "He's coming," Elizabeth whispered, her form now barely visible. "Hurry, please hurry." They replaced the last stone and began to apply the plaster, working by lantern light now, as the church had grown dim as twilight despite the fact that it was only mid-afternoon. And then, as Edmund smoothed the final handful of plaster over the repaired wall, making it as seamless as he could. The chapel was suddenly illuminated by a flash of light so bright it left them all momentarily blind when Edmund's vision cleared. He saw, standing in the center of the chapel, a figure that made his blood run cold. It was a man tall and stern, dressed in the elaborate costume of the Stuart period wig, coat, breeches, all rendered in shades of gray and shadow. His face was twisted in an expression of fury, his eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. Sir Edward Malpas had manifested at last. Fools, the apparition said, and its voice was like iron grinding on stone, harsh and commanding. You do not understand what you have done. You have not freed them, you have condemned them to an eternity of incompleteness, and you have interfered with matters beyond your comprehension. Edmund stepped forward, placing himself between the spectre and the two women. We have done what justice demanded. Those children deserved proper rest, and we have tried to provide it. Sir Edward's laugh was terrible, devoid of any humor. Justice? What is justice to the dead? They are gone, scattered, nothing but echoes and memories. What you saw, what you spoke to, those were not truly William and Elizabeth. They are constructs, phantasms created by my ritual, given shape by my will. You cannot free them because they were never truly bound. You cannot give them rest because they do not truly exist. You're lying, Miss Darrow said, her voice shaking but determined. We saw them. We spoke with them. They were real. They were real once, Sir Edward conceded, moving closer, his form seeming to grow larger and more menacing with each step. But I took that reality from them when I took their hearts. What remains is mine, has always been mine, will always be mine. And you, he pointed at Edmund with a long, spectral finger, you have ensured that it will remain so forever, by sealing them once more in darkness, by leaving them incomplete. Edmund felt doubt creeping into his mind. Was it possible? Could they have been deceived? He looked toward where he had last seen the children, but they were gone, vanished, leaving only the chill air and the echoing silence. But then he heard it faint but unmistakable Elizabeth's voice, not in his ears but in his mind. Do not listen to him. He lies. He has always lied. We are more real than he knows, more real than he can bear to acknowledge, and we will have our vengeance. The chapel suddenly erupted in chaos. The lanterns went out again, plunging them into darkness. Edmund heard Mrs. Marsh scream, heard Miss Darrow calling his name. He reached out blindly, trying to find them, and his hand touched something cold and solid, Sir Edward's form. As tangible in that moment as any living flesh. He recoiled, stumbling backward, and fell against the sealed wall. And as he pressed against it, he felt intense heat, emanating from behind the stones, growing stronger with each passing second. The wall that had been icy cold moments before was now hot enough to burn, and Edmund lurched away from it with a cry of pain. Light flared again, and Edmund saw that the chapel was filled with smoke. No, not smoke, but a kind of luminous mist that seemed to boil up from the floor itself. And in that mist, shapes were forming, figures of flame, dancing and writhing, growing larger and more distinct. Sir Edward's spectre was still visible, but it was retreating now, backing away from the wall, its expression no longer furious but terrified. No, it said, its voice rising to a shriek. No, you cannot. I will not allow it. But even as it spoke, the flames were spreading, not consuming anything physical, but rather burning away the very fabric of the supernatural, dissolving the shadows and the cold and the oppressive presence that had hung over the chapel for so long. And in the heart of those flames, Edmund saw them one last time, William and Elizabeth, hand in hand, no longer pale and ethereal, but blazing with a light that seemed to come from within them. They looked at Edmund, and he saw on their faces not anger or sorrow, but something else, something that might have been peace or triumph, or simply profound relief. Thank you, they said together, their voices blending into a single sound that was like music. We are whole now. We are free. The flames surged higher, engulfing Sir Edward's form, and Edmund heard the spectre's final scream, a sound of such anguish and terror that it would haunt him for the rest of his days. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The flames vanished, the mist dissipated, and the chapel was simply a chapel, once more, cold stone and silent air, with 3 living people standing in the center of it, shaken but unharmed. Edmund reached out with trembling fingers and touched the chest. It was icy cold, far colder than the surrounding stone, and he felt a shock run through him at the contact. Not physical, exactly, but something else. A surge of emotion that was not his own. Anger, sorrow, desperate longing, all tangled together in a knot of intensity that left him gasping. "Dr. Ashworth, what have you found?" Miss Darrow's voice came from the other side of the wall, anxious and strained. "The chest," Edmund managed to say. "It's here, but it's locked, and I haven't the key. Can you bring it out? We can break it open outside." Edmund grasped the chest with both hands, ignoring the cold that seemed to burn his palms, and lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as he moved it, he heard something shift inside, a wet, sliding sound that made his gorge rise. He passed the chest through the opening to Miss Darrow, then climbed out himself. They stood together in the chapel, looking down at the innocuous-seeming box that contained such dreadful contents. "We should open it now," Edmund said. "We should see what's inside, and then we must decide how to proceed." Miss Darrow nodded, though her face was white and her hands shook as she helped Edmund position the chest on the floor. He raised the hammer, aimed it at the old padlock, and brought it down with all his strength. The lock shattered on the second blow, and the lid sprang open. Inside, nestled in what appeared to be a bed of salt and herbs, were 2 objects that Edmund at first could not quite comprehend. They were shriveled, dark, no longer recognizable as what they had once been, but there was no mistaking what they were meant to represent. Hearts, the preserved hearts of 2 children, taken from their bodies more than 100 years ago and kept here, in this unholy reliquary, as part of a ritual that had failed, but had nevertheless left its terrible mark on the world. As Edmund stared at the contents of the chest, the temperature in the chapel dropped even further, and the sounds that had been mere whispers suddenly swelled into something louder. Voices, children's voices, rising in what might have been triumph or fury or both. And then the lights went out. Both lanterns extinguished simultaneously, as though some invisible hand had snuffed them, plunging the chapel into absolute darkness. Edmund heard Miss Darrow gasp, heard the rustle of her cloak as she moved closer to him. He reached out blindly, found her arm, held it tightly. "Do not be afraid," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We have done what they wanted. We have found them, but what do they want now?" Miss Darrow whispered, "Dr. Ashworth, there is something here with us. I can feel it." Edmund could feel it, to a presence, or rather to presences, very close now, closer than they had ever been. He could feel the cold of them, could almost hear their breathing. And then, in the darkness, he felt something touch his hand, small fingers, icy cold. Grasping his own, "Thank you," a voice said, right beside his ear. A child's voice, soft and clear. "Thank you for finding us, Elizabeth." Edmund breathed. "We have been waiting so long," another voice said, this one from his other side. "The boy, William. So long in the dark. And he is here too, you know. He has never left. He is bound here as we are, bound by what he did." "Sir Edward?" Edmund asked. "He thought he could cheat death," Elizabeth's voice said. "He thought he could take our lives and make them his own. But death came for him anyway, and now he cannot leave, cannot rest. He is here, trapped in this place, as we are trapped. But we are stronger than he is. We have been growing stronger all these years, feeding on his fear and guilt." The darkness seemed to pulse with malevolence, and Edmund heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, agonized moan, coming from everywhere and nowhere, the sound of a soul in torment. "What do you want?" Edmund asked. "What must we do to set this right?" "Burn them," William said. "Burn the hearts and bury our bones properly in consecrated ground. Do this, and we can rest. Do this, and he will have no anchor to hold him here. The fire that would not touch him in life will consume what remains of his sin. We will do it," Edmund promised. "We will do everything you ask." The small, cold hands released his own, and he felt rather than saw the 2 figures step back. The darkness seemed to lighten slightly, as though some of its oppressive weight had lifted, and after a moment, Edmund was able to fumble for his matches and relight his lantern. The chapel was empty save for himself and Miss Darrow. The chest sat open on the floor, its horrible contents still visible. But the sense of immediate presence, of being watched and judged, had faded. Miss Darrow was pale and shaking, her eyes wide. "Did you hear them? Did you hear their voices?" "I heard them," Edmund confirmed. He closed the chest gently, reverently, and lifted it. "Come, we must take this away from here. We must do what they asked." They gathered their tools and left the chapel, locking the screen door behind them. As they walked through the church toward the main entrance, Edmund glanced back once and saw, standing in the shadows near the chancel, a darker shadow, the figure of a man, watching them. He could not make out the features, but he felt the malevolence radiating from it, the desperate rage of one who had sinned beyond redemption, and could find no escape from the consequences. Outside, the mist had thickened even further, and the churchyard was a maze of gray shapes. They hurried toward the rectory, Edmund clutching the chest to his breast, Miss Darrow close beside him. Neither spoke until they were safely inside, with the door locked behind them. In the study, with a fire burning brightly in the grate, they sat and tried to gather their composure. Edmund poured them each a glass of his uncle's brandy, and they drank in silence, the warmth of the alcohol helping to dispel some of the cold that had settled into their bones. "What now?" Miss Darrow asked finally. "We cannot simply burn those things in the fireplace and pretend nothing has happened." "No," Edmund agreed. "This must be done properly. Tomorrow we will speak with the diocese, explain what we have found, and request permission for a proper burial. The bones must be removed from that sealed chamber and interred in the churchyard, with a Christian ceremony. And the hearts," he looked at the chest, which sat on the desk like an accusation. "The hearts must be destroyed, but it should be done with witnesses, with documentation. This is evidence of a crime, after all, even if the criminal is long dead. And Sir Edward, what of him?" Edmund shook his head slowly. "I don't know. If the children are right, if he is bound here by his own sin, then perhaps when they are freed, when the physical remnants of his crime are destroyed, he too will be released to whatever judgment awaits him." Miss Darrow set down her glass and rose. "I should return home. It is very late, and I fear I will not sleep regardless. But I should at least try." Edmund saw her to the door, and they stood for a moment in the hallway. To people who had shared an experience that would bind them together forever, whether they wished it or not. "Thank you," Edmund said quietly. "I could not have done this alone." "Nor I," Miss Darrow replied. She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of solidarity and comfort. "Whatever comes next, Dr. Ashworth, we will face it together." After she left, Edmund returned to the study and sat before the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about all that had happened. The chest sat on the desk beside him, and he found himself unable to look away from it for long. Inside that box were the hearts of two children, preserved by dark arts for a purpose that had failed, and yet, by that very failure, had created something perhaps even worse than Sir Edward had intended. The children had not moved on to whatever lay beyond death. They had remained trapped and aware, their anger and grief compounding over to centuries until they had become something more than mere ghosts. And yet, for all their power, for all their terrible persistence, they had retained something of their humanity. They had asked for help, had sought justice rather than mere revenge. They wanted only what was right, proper burial, acknowledgement of what had been done to them, and release from the bonds that held them to this world. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Edmund finally allowed himself to sleep, slumped in the armchair before the dying fire. And for the first time since arriving in Ravensmere, he slept deeply and without dreams. Edmund looked at the sealed wall. The plaster they had applied was blackened and cracked, as though exposed to intense heat. But the stones behind were intact, and there was something else, a feeling of emptiness, of completion, as though something that had been wrong for centuries had finally been set right. "It's done," he whispered. "They're at rest." Miss Darrow nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Marsh simply stood in silence, her practical facade shattered by what she had witnessed. They left the chapel together and emerged into the church proper, where they found, to their amazement, that the sun had broken through the clouds and was streaming through the stained glass windows, filling the space with colored light. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the church was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and calm that Edmund had not felt since arriving in Ravensmere. They walked out into the churchyard, and the world seemed transformed. The mist had cleared, the air was warm and fresh, and birds were singing in the yew trees. It was as though a burden had been lifted, not just from the church but from the entire village. "What now?" Miss Darrow asked, looking at Edmund with exhausted eyes. "Now," Edmund said, "we wait for the authorities. We document what we found, arrange for the proper burial of the remains, and try to find some way to explain all of this in rational terms." Mrs. Marsh gave a shaky laugh. "Rational terms? Dr. Ashworth, I'm not sure any rational explanation will suffice." Edmund smiled despite his exhaustion. "Perhaps not, but we must try. The world operates on reason, after all, or so we tell ourselves." They walked back to the rectory together, three people bound by an experience that none of them fully understood, but all of them knew had been real, had been important, had changed them in ways they would spend years trying to comprehend. Behind them, in the Malpas chapel, the sealed wall stood silent, and within it, two small sets of remains lay at rest at last, their hearts restored to them, their spirits finally free to move beyond the world that had held them captive for so long. And somewhere in the spaces between life and death, two children ran together through fields of light, holding hands and laughing, while behind them, a darker shadow faded into nothingness, consumed at last by the judgment it had so long evaded. The days following the manifestation in the Malpas chapel passed in a blur of official inquiries, ecclesiastical investigations, and careful documentation. The Bishop of Norwich arrived with a small retinue of clergy and officials, their skepticism evident until they examined the chapel themselves and found the blackened, heat-cracked plaster on a wall that showed no signs of fire anywhere else in the building. The sealed chamber was opened once more, this time under proper supervision, and the remains within were examined by a physician from Norwich. His report, delivered with professional detachment that barely concealed his unease, confirmed that the bones were indeed those of two children, approximately 12 and 10 years of age, dating from the late 17th or early 18th century. The small chest and its contents were noted in the official record with careful euphemism. Organic materials of uncertain origin, possibly connected to historical practices of dubious nature. Edmund's detailed account was received with varying degrees of belief. The bishop, a pragmatic man who had spent 40 years in rural parishes, listened without interruption and then said simply, "There are more things in Norfolk than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Dr. Ashworth, I have learned not to dismiss what the witnesses of good character tell me they have seen." The remains were buried in the churchyard on a gray October morning, with a simple service conducted by the bishop himself. A modest stone was erected, bearing the inscription, "William and Elizabeth Malpas 1681 to 1693 requiescant in pace." The entire village attended, standing in silent witness as the coffins were lowered into the ground. Edmund noticed that the faces around him showed not fear, but relief, as though a weight they had carried for generations had finally been lifted. Mrs. Kettle approached him after the service, leaning heavily on her stick. "You did well, Dr. Ashworth," she said quietly. "Better than your uncle. God rest his soul. You gave them what they needed, not just discovery, but completion. They can rest now. And Sir Edward?" Edmund asked. The old woman's face hardened. "Gone to his accounting, I should think. The judgment he escaped in life has found him at last. There's been no sign of him since that day, and there won't be again. Some debts can only be paid in full." Edmund remained in Ravensmere for another month, settling his uncle's affairs and ensuring that all the legal and ecclesiastical matters were properly concluded. The chest and its contents were taken away by the bishop's officials, to be kept in the cathedral archives as a historical curiosity or destroyed. Edmund suspected, though no one would say so directly, the rectory felt different now, lighter somehow, as though the shadows in its corners had receded. Mrs. Gannett reported that she slept better than she had in years, and that the house no longer felt oppressive to her. The church, too, seemed transformed. The Malpas chapel lost its reputation for coldness and unease. Indeed, several parishioners reported that it now felt like the warmest and most peaceful part of the Building. Miss Darrow continued her historical research, though she admitted to Edmund that she now approached certain subjects with greater caution. Mrs. Marsh returned to her practical concerns, though Edmund noticed she now attended church with notable regularity. Perhaps, he thought, seeking reassurance that the natural world still operated by comprehensible rules. On Edmund's final evening in Ravensmere, he walked alone through the churchyard at dusk. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. He stopped at the grave of William and Elizabeth Malpas and stood for a long moment, remembering their faces, their voices, the terrible burden they had carried for so long. As he stood there, he felt or thought he felt the faintest touch on his hand, like the brush of a child's fingers, cold but gentle, and in his mind, so softly he might have imagined it, he heard two voices speaking in unison. "Thank you. We are home." Edmund smiled, tears pricking his eyes. "Rest well," he whispered to the evening air. Rest well. At last, Edmund returned to Cambridge a changed man. He resumed his lectures and his research, but he found himself increasingly drawn to subjects he had once dismissed: folklore, supernatural testimonies, the thin places where the rational world seemed to intersect with something else, something older and stranger. He never spoke publicly of what had happened at Ravensmere, but he wrote an extensive private account, which he sealed and deposited with his college, with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after his death. Whether it would ever be believed, he did not know, but he felt compelled to leave a record nonetheless, for the sake of truth, and for the sake of two children who had waited more than 2 centuries to have their story told. He married Miss Sarah Darrow the following spring, and they divided their time between Cambridge and Norfolk, collaborating on a historical study of East Anglian parishes that would eventually become a standard reference work. Neither of them spoke often of that October in Ravensmere, but sometimes, on autumn evenings when the light took on a particular quality, they would exchange glances and remember. Mrs. Kettle lived to the age of 94, and on her deathbed, she told her grandchildren that the old curse on Ravensmere had been lifted at last, that the village could finally breathe freely. "Mind you remember," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "that the past never truly dies. It waits and watches until someone comes along brave enough to face it. And when they do, when they shine a light into the dark places, well, sometimes what's hidden there can finally rest." The Malpas chapel stood quiet for a generation. Then, too, the story of the sealed wall and the murdered children became local legend, softened by time and retelling until it seemed almost quaint, a Gothic tale from a more superstitious age. But on certain nights, particularly on St. Bartholomew's Eve, when the veil between worlds grows thin, visitors to Ravensmere's churchyard sometimes report seeing the children playing among the graves, holding hands and laughing, their forms as insubstantial as moonlight. They do not frighten those who see them, these witnesses say. They seem happy, at peace, simply enjoying an eternal childhood in a place that once held them captive, but now allows them to roam free. And in the Malpas chapel, where Edmund Ashworth once broke through a wall and found the evidence of an ancient crime, there is only silence now, the good, clean silence of a place where old wrongs have been righted, where justice has been served at last, and where the dead can finally, truly rest in peace.